I've been wanting to get into resin casting, and one of the tools that's really helpful in getting a clear cast is a pressure pot, so that you can cast your resin under a higher air pressure. I've been looking for a used pressure pot, and one came up on Craigslist, and I went to have a look at it, and he ended up selling it to me for $25, so it was a good deal. But I had to make it work. These pressure pots are made for painting, and I guess you usually would fill the container with paint, then push the paint out with air pressure, and get a paint sprayer that holds a large amount of paint for doing a house or a building or a boat or something. The first thing to do was to make it airtight so that it would actually hold pressure.
It leaks.
So I started by trying to take the bits off of the lid that I didn't really need. So this works by having a tank with a lid on it, and the lid can be removed so that you can add things to the inside of the tank, mainly paint, which is what this was made to do. But I want to be able to place cast resin parts within the tank. And I started to hunt down the leaks in the lid system. The first time I tested it, it seemed like the air outlet nozzle had a leak. So I replaced those parts. And I just used threading tape at this point just to make it not quite so permanent. Although it'll probably end up being permanent. Now, I'm not a plumber. I don't work with air pressure on a regular basis. This is sort of all new to me, so I'm trying to figure it out as I go. So I put it back together and I tried to get air pressure. I didn't notice at this point that two of the little clamps for the lid weren't attached, just because I'd forgotten to put them back, and that's why it was leaking. So when I put those back up, I decided there must be a leak around the regulators at the top and where the air comes in. I could hear a little bit of a leak. So I took that off. It's the kind of connection with the little rubber ring inside the threaded cap. I'm sure it has a name, but I don't know what it is. That all looked okay, so I put it back together and I just cinched it down a little tighter. That seemed to work. I think it was just loose. And I tested it again. Now there's some kind of valve on the lid. I don't know if it's like a relief valve of some sort. The rubber ring on the inside was completely worn away, and I wasn't quite sure how to fix that or really what the valve was supposed to do. So I just found a cap to go over that threaded opening, and that seemed to work pretty well. And I tested it again. At this point, I could hear the seal on the lid leaking. I was hoping I was going to be able to use this, but in looking at it closer, it was in really bad shape. So I took the risk of just removing it and hoping I could figure out a way to replace it. The reasoning for using the high pressure to cast resin is that instead of getting rid of the bubbles like you would with a vacuum chamber, with the high pressure, you squeeze the bubbles down to where they're so small that you can't see them. So they're still there in the cast, but the cast appears clear. So now that I had the seal out, I wanted to be able to hold the lid upside down with all the stuff coming out of the top. So I made a jig that I could slide through parts of the lid and hold it upside down so that the seal would be facing up. I wanted to clean up the edge where the seal would go, as it's really irregular. And I don't know if that's how it's supposed to be, or it's just gotten old, or why it's so non-planar, I guess would be the word. So my first thought was to fill the space for the seal with silicone caulk. So I filled that trench. I made a little scraper that would allow me to make the surface of the the caulk flat, so it would make a good contact with the rim of the pressure pot. And I let that sit for a few days and set up. And once I did that, I could test it again. My little jig worked, but it was hard getting it on and off. And I brought it up to about 30 pounds of pressure, and it seemed like it was working. I thought I had fixed it, and I went a little bit higher, and the seal sort of blew out. I kind of was suspecting this. The pressure of the lid doesn't really hold the seal tight enough to squish the silicone into a sort of more rigid form, and it's just too squishy, and it sort of blew out, and it just can't hold that kind of pressure. So I had to dig all that silicone out. I realized I have a drag knife for the CNC machine that I've never used and I've wanted to find a project for. So what I thought I could do is make the seal that I needed on the CNC machine, as I couldn't find the right size online. And I can cut out the seal that I need. And this actually worked even better than I thought it was going to work. It cut a perfect circle. And the rubber stayed in place and didn't move around on me. So I can clean that up with alcohol, kind of get the glue that I used off and the dust that got on it off. And I can clean up the surface on the lid, then just put it in place. And it seemed to stay in the lid okay. And I put all the clamps back on the pot. So the way you want to do these clamps is in pairs that are opposite from each other, and then go around in a circle so that you don't get one side that's tighter than another side. And I tested it again, and I could still hear a leak. So it seemed like the little outflow valve was leaking, and it was the same kind of attachment with the little rubber seal. So I just tightened it up some, and that seemed to work. Then I got out the soap.
Worse.
And I found a leak in the center. There's this center mechanism that I'm not really sure what it is. My guess is it's for stirring the paint that goes inside the pot. So I really don't need this for what I'm going to be using this for. So I took off as much as I could. And there was this giant bolt on the inside of the lid, and I just could not get it to move. The lid was a little rusty, but the bolt wasn't. And I tried the wrench on the inside. I tried a pipe wrench on the outside. I found a little set screw that I thought might be holding things in place, but it really didn't seem to be doing anything. Then I clamped the lid in place, and this actually helped. And I was able to slowly work the bolt free and get this whole center thing out. I had hoped that the hole in the lid would be a threaded hole and I could just find a cap to go on it, but it wasn't. It's just a big hole in the lid. So what I thought I would do is make 2 rubber rings and 2 metal plates to sort of sandwich around that hole and plug it up. So I cut 2 smaller gaskets and then 2 plates out of aluminum. Now I haven't cut aluminum before, so this was a little bit of a learning process. My first mistake was using a down cutting bit, which just shoves the chips into the cut and completely does not work. My second attempt, my bit speed was way too low and it just wasn't going to cut enough. And my cut was far too deep. So in the third attempt, I finally got the kind of bit correct. I got the depth of each cut correct and the speed and feed of the bit correct. And it worked well enough where the bit wasn't even warm when it was done. In my experimenting to get the circle cut, I didn't really think to cut the hole in the center, which I really should have done on a CNC machine. So I drilled those out on the drill press, which was easy enough. Then I could sand a little bit on the aluminum, I had 2 little bridges to sand off, and I wanted to sand the surface, as some of these surfaces were going to have to make a seal with my rubber rings. My thought with the bolt going through the 2 plates was that I could make it sort of a long bolt and then attach a handle to the outer end. And I could use that to lift the lid up and down. But that ended up being too complicated, and I made sort of a fatal error in that I used a locking washer with the washer and the bolt. And of course, the locking washer has a slit in it, and that just made a great big hole for air to rush out. So I had really thought about the ring and the outer edge of the plate, but hadn't given much thought to the hole in the center. So my next attempt was a shorter bolt, and I just used the head of the bolt at the outer plate. This would minimize the number of seams, and I also used some thread sealer on the bolt. So I tested that again, and my centerpiece worked, and that was holding air, but now the gasket was leaking. So I decided I could glue it in place with a thin layer of silicone adhesive. So it wouldn't be nearly as thick this time. It would just be thick enough to hold the rubber in place and to make a good seal between the rubber and the lid. And the other thing I did is, as the sealant was drying, I had the lid clamped in place so that it would force the new seal and the sealant to be the shape of the rim of the lid, which means that I always have to put it back in the same orientation, but that's good practice anyways. So I clamped that to the bottom and let that set up for 24 hours. In opening and closing and turning these knobs on the lid so many times, I thought maybe I could make a little wood handle that would fit over the metal handle on the pressure pot. The handles on the pressure pot I know are designed to be tightened up by hand, so I didn't want to make a wrench with a long handle that would give me a lot of force to over tighten those lid bolts. So I just wanted to make a handle that would be a little bit easier to hold, but wouldn't be very big. You can see the new seal actually takes the form of the old seal. So I think I've got it pretty close. So once I have the clamps in place, I can tighten them up with my little handle. It's a little bit of a pain because it's separate, but it definitely helps in tightening up the clamps. Now I can test it.
I don't hear any leaks. Shh. Okay, that's 30 pounds of pressure, and I don't hear any leaks. Okay, now we're at 40 pounds of pressure, and I don't hear any leaks. We're at 62. No, I guess I don't hear anything. 62 pounds of pressure, and I don't hear anything. It's been like 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes, and it's gone down maybe a pound. That's good enough for me.
So there isn't really a big finale or a beautiful object to look at in this story. It's just that the pressure pot works now, and I'm hoping to start doing some resin casting, mostly for wood turning.
Huh. So that still has bubbles, it's just they're much smaller. And they're bigger. Interesting.
Thanks for watching.